Well, good evening, Brent, and welcome along to the Lodge Hope of Kurrachee, number 337, 12 Zoom meeting. I never expected, Brent, that we would have 4, but we're now up to 12, and I'm grateful for all our speakers, and in particular all our guests who come on a weekly basis to join us. This is being recorded as usual, and it will be placed on the Lodge Hope of Kurrachee Facebook pages later on this evening, Brian, and you can access it from there. And please, if there's any debate afterwards and comments and questions, we can carry on within the Facebook pages. As the Grand Lodge of Scotland digital guidelines remind us, we need to keep our video on. If there's any questions, can you please put them in the chat during the meeting and at the end of the meeting? And at the very end, I will unmute everyone as usual so you can say your goodbyes. Before we move on this evening, Brian, I'd just like to take a minute to make mention of the passing this morning of Brother Jack Turpie, past master of the Anchor Lodge of Research through in Renfrewshire West. One of our sister research lodges. I first saw Jack, I always called him the Stamp Man, because he was a great lover and a great expert on Masonic philately, even. Philately. I'm in philanthropy for a business, Brian, so excuse me getting them mixed up. But it was very sad to hear this morning that he's passed to the Grand Lodge above, and the thoughts of Lodge Hope of Kurrachee are with his Mother Lodge and the Anchor Lodge of Research. This evening, Brian, I'm delighted to welcome back probably the most well-travelled brother of the Zoom enlightenment, because Brother Bob has been all over America and he's regularly presenting in Georgia under the Grand Lodge of Georgia, and he presents at least twice a week for I think the last 4 or 5 weeks, and many of you will have seen his presentations there. But this evening I've asked him to come along to talk to you about one of Scotland's, probably one of their most famous, Brian, and he's going to talk to us about him not as a poet but as a Freemason. So, Brother Robert Cooper, Curator of the Grand Lodge of Scotland Museum and Library, I hand over to you to enlighten us about Brother Robert Burns.
Thanks very much, Gordon. Good evening, brethren, each and every one of you. Thanks very much for tuning in. I've always said that Lodge Hope of Kurrachee 337 has led the way during this pandemic by starting Zoom meetings, and it's everybody else that's playing catch up with the Lodge. So congratulations to the Lodge for a really great initiative. I too would like to add my condolences on hearing about Jack Turpie. I knew Jack pretty well. I know he hadn't been well for a couple of years at least, and he had health issues for some time. But you're quite right. Jack was a great collector of stamps with a Masonic connection, and when he knew I was going away somewhere, he would say, well, wherever you go, you know, have a good look around and see what you can find in terms of stamps. And so he had me bringing stamps from various parts of the world that usually depicted a Freemason. I think the last ones I got him were ones that were about John Wayne, you know, the famous actor. So yeah, it was really sad to hear about Jack, and I never got to connect with him in the last couple of years, which is really quite sad. Anyway, it all comes to us one way or the other sooner or later. So tonight, Robert Burns, another departed brother, although departed a long time ago. I have to say that, I mean, I am not a Burns expert, and neither can I recite long pieces of poetry by him, but he was a very, very interesting character. And I think it's an indication, unfortunately, that as Freemasonry is no longer as respected as it used to be, and certainly in this day and age, as we all know, we have problems with the media, with some politicians and with some religious leaders. And I think for that reason, I mean, that's been going on for quite a long time. And for that reason, Robert Burns and his Masonic membership isn't discussed, even if it is known. But it seems very clear to me that the fact that he was a Freemason, and what's more, an ardent Freemason to boot, people simply don't want to know. And if they do know, they would prefer to ignore the fact. So the more that we can promote Robert Burns and his Masonic career, or his Masonic life, in the process of doing that, we're promoting Scottish Freemasonry at the same time. So I would make no bones about, wherever I go, reminding people that Robert Burns was a Freemason. It was one of the major aspects of his life, certainly his adult life. And I'm very disappointed when I go to the Burns Museum very occasionally in Ayrshire to discover that Freemasonry is a tiny part of the exhibit to Brother Burns. And the exhibit really only consists of a very small corner, and the principal exhibit is the mall that he used in Lodge St Andrew in Dumfries. And it seems to be that this is a political decision to downplay his Masonic membership for whatever reason. I don't know. Perhaps it's a little bit like what we've seen over the last couple of weeks with people revising history in order to make history fit their own particular views. If so, that's rather sad, because you can't change history. You might dislike it, but you can't change history. The fact that Robert Burns was a Freemason and some people don't like it is unfortunate, but you can't change the fact that he was a Freemason. So you shouldn't dislike the man. You can dislike the organization if you wish, but rubbishing the man is not, in my opinion, is basically dishonest, because you're simply telling a lie by omission by not mentioning his Masonic membership. Now, don't get me wrong, Robert Burns and his Masonic life is one example amongst many that we seem to be undergoing at the moment, where people will remove the Masonic life of individuals because it doesn't suit their particular agenda. I'll give you an example. Just very recently, I was reading a biography of Thomas Telford, the Scottish engineer who built bridges and canals all over Britain. He was a member of 3 lodges, and I found a member of a Royal Arch chapter. But in his biography, not a mention of his Masonic career. And when I wrote to the publisher to point this out, I didn't even get the courtesy of a reply. So that's the problem we have. Now, I have to say, this initiative by this lodge for Zoom meetings, to a large extent, levels the playing field for us as Freemasons, because we can discuss Burns's Masonic membership, for example, tonight. But it also means that anyone who wants to view these lectures will hopefully become a bit better educated on such matters as Freemasonry and Robert Burns. So tonight, what I've decided to do, because there is a rather wonderful painting in the Grand Lodge of Scotland Museum that people from all over the world come to see, which is something else that very few people care to mention in all sorts of different places, but particularly the tourist industry. They seem to be happy to ignore the fact that we bring tourists from all over the world because Robert Burns was a Freemason. So we receive visits from mainly English-speaking countries, to be fair, who are coming to Scotland because they are Freemasons and because they know Robert Burns was a Freemason, and they're interested in seeing his homeland and what Freemasonry is like here. And the painting that hangs in the museum in Freemasons Hall on George Street here in Edinburgh is probably the best visual image that we can use to promote Robert Burns and Freemasonry. So we're going to talk about that painting tonight, and a little bit about Burns, but as well as that, I want to explore the characters that are depicted in the painting, because it gives us an insight into the type of people at that time who were Freemasons. And many of them led extremely colourful lives. So I'll tell you about some of my favourite individuals. I can't tell you about them all, there's simply too many, but some of them are extremely interesting indeed. So a little bit about the lodge. I suppose we all know that Lodge Canongate Cowinning number 2 meets in the Canongate, surprise, surprise, in Edinburgh. And it's first mentioned, the lodge is first mentioned in 1677 when they approached Mother Cowinning for permission to form a lodge in the Canongate. Now, Mother Cowinning didn't issue charters as such, but they would, at that time, but they would obviously give permission, because that's exactly what they record in the minutes, that they'd received a request from the Masons of the Canongate to form a lodge there. Now, that in itself is a little bit telling, because at that time, the Canongate, although it's now very much in the centre of Edinburgh, Canongate Borough was actually just outside Edinburgh city walls. And I mean, if you happen to be there in Edinburgh, the crossroads at the High Street where the Royal Mile is broken, if you like, between Edinburgh and Canongate, you'll see the World's End pub, which is infamous for another rather gruesome reason. But the World's End pub is so named because that was the gate where you left the world. You left Edinburgh and you were at the world's end, and you were going out into the wilderness, so to speak. So perhaps that gives you a little bit of a clue as to why the guys in Canongate didn't ask the Lodge of Edinburgh for permission to form a lodge. I suspect they already knew what the answer would be, and they weren't going to ask the Lodge of Edinburgh for their blessing to form a lodge. So they went to Mother Cowinning, who probably weren't so aware of the local difficulties in Edinburgh, and they gave permission for the lodge to be formed. And that's recorded in Mother Cowinning's minutes, as I say, in the year 1677. The lodge becomes even more important later, for in the year 1736. Well, as you know, the Grand Lodge of Scotland was formed, and one of the prime movers, if not the prime mover, was the Lodge of Canongate Cowinning number 2. It was one of the 4 lodges that formed the Grand Lodge of Scotland, and as I say, they were very much the dominant partner in the 4 lodges that founded the Grand Lodge of Scotland. The other 3, apart from Lodge Canongate Cowinning, were the Lodge of Edinburgh, Mary's Chapel, Cowinning Scots Arms, and Leith Cowinning. So, and the meetings, all the preparatory meetings, and indeed the inaugural meeting, were all held in Canongate Cowinning's premises in St John Street in Edinburgh. And it's another interesting fact that the building that the lodge still meets in to this day, St John's Chapel in St John Street, is the oldest purpose-built lodge in the world. It was built in 1735, and as I say, it remains the oldest purpose-built lodge room in the world. There are older lodge buildings than that. I know there's a couple in Fife. Forgive me if I can't remember, but I know one that meets in a very old vault in Fife. And so there are much, much older buildings, but this was purpose-built for lodge meetings in 1735. And as I say, it's the oldest purpose-built lodge room in the world. So you can begin to see that what's going on in Edinburgh and in the Canongate in particular is one of the things that becomes very important within our history. And as the 18th century progresses, Lodge Canongate Cowinning number 2 begins to attract all sorts of very important people, lords and the like. You know, the great and the good, so to speak. And this becomes one of the centres of Freemasonry, this particular lodge. And when Robert Burns came to Scotland, came to Edinburgh to oversee the publication of his second edition, the Edinburgh edition, when he came here in 1786. When he came here, he obviously gravitated to Lodge Canongate Kilwinning, because that's where many of his sponsors would be. And like the Kilmarnock edition published in Kilmarnock earlier, a large number of the subscribers to the second edition were Freemasons. And so, you know, he obviously had contacts in that lodge. And so that's where the painting comes in, because he was so well known, and he was an extremely important figure in Scottish society by this time. He was by this time very famous, having had his work published, and everybody there was a lot of fans out there, shall we say. And so he was made the poet laureate of Lodge Canongate Kilwinning in 1787. Now, if I can just get this screen sharing thing to work.
You should be able to, Bob.
Good. I've tested it a couple of times, and I think we're going to get it okay. We just need to. I'm not technically minded, but I have been shown how to do this. So just bear with me a second. It takes a little while for it to load. What I've done, for those who are interested in such things, I now know to upload my files to Dropbox, and from there I can share things much more easily. So we're just about there.
Bob, when you're looking for that, I'll just inform the Brethren from out with the province of Fife and Kinross that the lodge that you're referring to is Elgin and Bruce, and it is the mother lodge of Brother Lord Elgin. And it's called, the buildings are the King's Cellars. And if you go to their website, there's some lovely information about that very ancient building.
Good, thanks for that, Gordon. If you can confirm that you can see this presentation on your screen.
Yes, we're good to go, Bob.
Yeah, right, good. Well, this is not one of these full-blown PowerPoint presentations, because we're focused very much indeed on this painting. So there is only one slide, and forgive me for calling them slides. I was brought up in the day of the old analog slide system. I don't know if you call them slides now, but that's what we've got. So, so this is the painting that we're going to talk about tonight. As I say, this is the one that hangs in the Grand Lodge Museum, and it's very much as you see it now. It does, I have to confess, need a bit of a clean, but I'm hoping that will be done in the fairly near future. It hasn't been cleaned during my 26-year tenure in office, but hopefully we'll get some cash to give it some good deep cleaning, because it is a bit dull in comparison to the original. So we can see that this is a very crowded scene, and the lodge room is very much as you see it today. If you go there, the only major thing that I can see from the painting that's not in the same position as that painting on the far wall right-hand side, which is of William St. Clair of Roslin, the first Grand Master Mason, who of course was a member of that lodge. And his initiation into that lodge is a very curious tale indeed. If we have time, we'll perhaps come back to that very strange arrangement. So as you can see in the painting, Robert Burns is the major character in here. He's being offered the laurel wreaths by the master of the lodge in recognition of the fact that he was on that evening, on the 1st of March, made the poet laureate of that particular lodge. So, you know, the 1st of March, I mean, it's a long time ago now, I know, but as I say, the characters were extremely interesting. Now, the date, what was happening on and about that date? Well, the 7 Years' War in Europe, and particularly in America, where it was called the French Indian War, and we're going to talk about a character that featured in that soon, had ended in 1767, 1767 or thereabouts. And so, you know, it was a turbulent time. And as you can see, there's a military man in front and center as well, who you know, is representative of the military personnel that were around at the time. A lot of the officers garrisoned in Edinburgh Castle. So let's talk about one or two of the individuals to give you a bit of a flavour of the kind of people that were around and about at the time. And let's start with the rather rotund chap sitting in the bottom right-hand corner, who is looking at the soldier next to him. This is Francis Grose, and there's always a connection, even no matter how distantly, with Robert Burns. This guy has got a much more intimate relationship with Robert Burns. His name is Francis Grose. He is, in fact, father of a Swiss watchmaker who practiced his trade in London. Hence the name. The name is clearly not Scottish. But Francis Grose, as you can see, didn't really have to work terribly hard, certainly not manually, for his living. He inherited his father's considerable fortune from making watches for the aristocracy, and Grose watches are still sought after today, not only because of their age, but because of their very precise and expert manufacture. So brother Francis, decided that because he didn't really have to work all that hard, he'd already got lots of money, he was a man of leisure, he decided he was going to just have a look around England and just basically roll around as a man of leisure. And what he decided to do, wherever he stayed in taverns in England, he would usually get into conversations with the locals, and he got some wonderful local stories. And what he did was he published these in the form of a book called The Antiquities of England, Antiquities of England and Wales. And of course, he thought, wow, this is wonderful. I'm actually getting paid for wandering around the country. And then he said, well, I hear there's lots of pubs in Scotland. I'll go there. And that's exactly what he did. He came to Scotland and he would visit the local taverns and inns and pubs, and he'd get involved with the locals and record their local tales. And so in some ways, he does a lot like a lot of what Robert Burns did, although Burns was more interested in the poetry and the song. Francis Grose was interested in the actual stories, but they had a common interest. When Francis reached Ayrshire, he met Robert Burns, and he said to Burns, "Go and tell me a really good story so I can put it in my next book." And Robert Burns said to him, "Well, okay, if I give you a piece of poetry for your book, I want, in return, I want you to draw me a picture of Alloway Kirk for a very particular reason." And so they came to that agreement, and what Robert Burns then did was sat down and wrote Tam O'Shanter. And of course, he wanted an illustration of Alloway Kirk to give him something to look at in respect of his poem, Tam O'Shanter. So Francis drew Alloway Kirk and did it quite elegantly, and it was one of Burns's treasured possessions. Fortunately, I don't know where it is now, but I can tell you that, well, before we explain that bit, what happened was that because Francis was under no financial pressure whatsoever, he just took his time with these things. Now, the agreement was with Burns that Tam O'Shanter would be published first in Francis's book, but Burns got fed up waiting, basically, because, as I say, Francis was in no particular hurry. So Tam O'Shanter was first published in Burns's own works, but Francis did eventually get round to publishing his own book called, surprise, surprise, The Antiquities of Scotland. And in that book, there is Tam O'Shanter, and on the opposite page, is his drawing, the drawing he gave to Burns of Alloway Kirk. So a very nice story. So we know that they were both Freemasons before Burns came to Edinburgh. And so when he gets to Edinburgh, lo and behold, here's Francis Grose, ensconced in Lodge Canongate Kilwinning #2. And no doubt they got together and shared a couple of beers or whatever, and renewed their acquaintance. So a very nice little story about how two Freemasons give rise to one of Scotland's most famous narrative poems by Burns, Tam O'Shanter. And for those of you who really look at the work of Burns, you will see that there are quite a lot of Masonic references in the work of Burns that are unknown to so-called Burns scholars, because they're not Freemasons. And Tam O'Shanter is one of them. I'll not give the game away at this stage, but it certainly has got Masonic elements in it. So that's our brother Francis. The next guy I want to talk about is on your bottom left-hand corner, wearing powdered wig. This is a chap called James Burnet, Lord Mondobo, or is it Lord Monbodo? I never can quite remember. He was a senior lawyer. He gets his title because he's a law lord. And he's very famous, certainly in Edinburgh at the time he was very famous, as well as being a superb legal mind. And occasionally, even today, some of his judgments, his court judgments, are used in Scottish courts today, because he was a groundbreaker in many ways in the Scottish legal system. But nobody really remembers him for that reason. They all remember him, those that do, remember him because he was a very eccentric gentleman. He had some very strange ideas. The most famous one, which I'll tell you about, is that he believed that all male children were born with a monkey's tail. What's more, he believed that there was a big female conspiracy in the School of Midwifery, which was based here at Edinburgh Medical School at the university. He believed that the midwives were all part of some kind of secret organization. You can see where he's getting these ideas from, in part anyway. And he believed that what actually happened was that when the child was born, the male child was born, the midwives cut off this monkey's tail or monkey-type tail from the male children in order to keep secret the fact that us men all originally had a monkey's tail at birth. And what's more, I mean, we have contemporary reports about his campaigns, because he really did believe this was a female conspiracy. He campaigned to have the School of Midwifery abolished, and when there was no midwives around, we would all realize that we did have a monkey's tail, and then we could decide whether we wanted to keep it or not. And so he campaigned to try and have this very recent profession suppressed, because he thought there was something very, very dodgy going on. Now, we all know, of course, that this is obviously pretty much nonsense. But what I can tell you is that at the time that he's raving on and on and on about this, at the same time, there is a gentleman who's a member of Lodge St. David #36, which was another very important lodge in Edinburgh, and it tended to attract ministers of religion and students of physic, as it was called, medical students from the university. And one of those medical students was by the name of Erasmus Darwin. Now, Erasmus Darwin was the grandfather of Charles Darwin, who wrote The Origin of the Species, basically claiming that we are all descended from apes. Now, I can just imagine, now we're now moving from known fact to speculation, but it's a little bit of fun. I can just imagine Erasmus Darwin telling his grandson Charles, you know, when I was at university in Edinburgh, there was this crazy old man running around claiming that we were all descended from monkeys. And whether or not Charles ever got that tale, and whether or not he ever set out to prove or disprove it, we're never going to know for sure. But it's a wonderful story that circulated, certainly at that time. And certainly our friend James Burnett is on record as trying to do away with the profession of midwifery for that reason. So again, another little story. So these are a couple of the characters that are surrounding Robert Burns during his time in Edinburgh, certainly. The next person, and probably the last one to tell you about, is an individual who's almost dead center of the screen, and he's the middle one of a group of three. I don't know if you can see him. He's wearing a wig. The guy on his left is in brown. The guy on his right is in blue, and you can really only see his head and shoulders. This is a very interesting chap by the name of John Williamson, and his story is probably the most exotic of them all. And again, we know a lot about him. He was from Aberdeen. He was a young boy in Aberdeen, and at a young age, can't be certain of his age because of the records of the time, but he was certainly a young teenager, and he was kidnapped from Aberdeen Beach, just outside the harbour. He was kidnapped and put aboard a ship at anchor in the harbour, and he was kidnapped along with dozens of other children of a variety of ages, both male and female. And he was shipped across the Atlantic to the colonies. And this is, again, it's a well-documented story, but basically he was, of all the children, he was probably one of the luckiest ones, because when he arrived, they were all sold into penal servitude, essentially legalized slavery. So although we are very conscious of slavery to this day, you have to also remember that a lot of European type people were also slaves, and that he is one of these examples. So Williamson, I think his name was Thomas, now that I remember it, we'll find out. But anyway, Williamson, regardless of his Christian name, Williamson was fortunate. He was sold to another Scot who came to consider him to be more of a son rather than a slave. Most of the children had a really rough time. They were typically sent to frontiersmen who were trying to hack a living out of the wilderness. Many of them simply perished. They were not paid, of course, because of the terms of their indenture, but they were fed and clothed probably not terribly well. And Williamson, as I say, was lucky enough to be sold to a Scot who was more sympathetic to his plight than most. And on his death, his master released him from servitude, so he was a free man. Now, this was in the early part of the 1750s, and Peter Williamson, his name came back to me there, definitely Peter Williamson, or Indian Pete, as he became known. Peter went off to fight the Indians. He joined the army, the militia anyway, guarding the frontier. And when the 7 Years' War, or the French-Indian War, as it was called, broke out in North America, he was fighting alongside British colonialists against the French and Indians. And we know a lot about this because he survived. He later published a book called French Indian Cruelty, which was a huge seller in its day. Anyway, Peter was fighting alongside other British people throughout this war. He was unlucky. He was captured. He was not captured by French people. He was captured by Indians who were allied with the French, and he suffered quite gravely because, having been captured, he was treated very much as a beast of burden. He just had to carry and fetch things. He was constantly tied up, and he was hobbled, so he couldn't run away. He was at night. He was tied up and thrown on the ground, basically, and he suffered incredibly badly during one particular winter. And so he decided that even if he ran away and was killed for doing that, it was far better than his situation at the time. Anyway, he did run away, and he managed just, according to his own account, he just managed to escape. He made his way back to the colonies, where he was released. I think he was actually, when I think about it, he was actually put aboard. He escaped and was then captured by the French, who put him aboard a ship back to Britain, repatriating. It was a prisoner exchange, and as a result of that exchange, he ended up back here in Britain, and he landed in London, but made his way to York, where seemingly he tried to get money to get back to Scotland from the local Freemasons. Now, whether or not he'd been made a Freemason in the colonies before he left for Britain, we'll probably never know. But certainly, he did try and get money from people in York. He did get money, and he went back to Aberdeen, his hometown. Now, this is a matter of court record. When he was in Aberdeen, he sued the Aberdeen City Council of the time for allowing the children to be kidnapped. There was grave suspicion that the officials, the council officials, were taking bribes from these slavers to allow their children to be shipped to America, to the American colonies. And he sued them for this gross dereliction of duty. And needless to say, of course, the very people that were listening to the case in court were all Aberdeen people. And so, needless to say, he didn't succeed in suing the council in Aberdeen. And that's how he ends up in Edinburgh, because he took his case to the High Court. And I suspect, but I don't know about this for sure, but I suspect our James Burnett character may have been his legal advisor. Anyway, again, as a matter of court record, Peter Williamson then sues Aberdeen City Council for damages in Edinburgh, and his case is successful. He wins his case, and Aberdeen City Council have to settle with him. They have to pay a substantial amount of money in terms of damages, and that set him up for life. He was able to buy a pub in Edinburgh, and he's very celebrated at the time, because every now and again, probably when he'd had a few of his own drinks, he would dress up as an Indian and dance around the streets to entertain the locals, complete with a tobacco pipe and a tomahawk and headdress and all the rest of it. So he's famous for that. And his book was a bestseller, as I say. And very interestingly, the frontispiece, which is a woodcut of himself dressed up as an Indian, immediately above the woodcut are Masonic symbols. square, compasses, plumb rule, and a level, although not in our normal configuration, but certainly in the way that they were commonly shown at that time. So in that sense, this idea that he was a Freemason in America and tried to get money from the Freemasons of York may well have been true. Certainly he was a member of Lodge Canongate Coinning number 2, and he's known to have supplied the booze for the harmonies because he was obviously an innkeeper or tavern keeper, and he had access to that kind of thing. So these are the kind of characters that we have surrounding Robert Burns. Now, just before I conclude, because I think I've probably bored you long enough, it's a very interesting thing has just appeared, if you like. I've been asked to make a small contribution to a book which mentions Burns. And during that little bit of research, I came across a very interesting fact. When Burns passed away in Dumfries, he apparently had asked that he be buried in St. Cuthbert's graveyard in a particular place, and that was the northeast corner. And he was ultimately buried in the northeast corner, but his grave was only marked by a very modest slab paid for by his wife Jean Armour, and later a lot of people decided this really wasn't good enough for Scotland's national bard, and so they decided they were going to fundraise and build what is now the Burns Mausoleum. So the poor guy was dug up by non-Masons because they didn't, or they weren't interested. Way back to the beginning of my story, they weren't interested at all about the fact that Burns was a Freemason, and therefore they saw no relevance to the place that he was interred initially. By a happy coincidence, however, they chose somewhere else that was almost as equally significant, and that was the southeast corner. So he's now buried in the southeast corner of St. Cuthbert's graveyard. So just a few facts about the characters around at the time of Burns's period in Edinburgh. The fact that he remained a committed Freemason all of his life. He died as senior warden of Lodge St. Andrew in Dumfries. And as I say, he died, of course, he died in the July. So the lodge wasn't meeting. So he died in active office as a Freemason. Again, unfortunately, these little things are simply never mentioned, and I don't know about you, but they do tend to annoy the hell out of me by the sheer omission of them. Hopefully you found that to be of some interest, and by all means, please ask some questions. I'm not promising you'll get an answer, but I will do my best.
Bob, as usual, on behalf of the members of Lodge Hope of Kurrachee and all our visitors this evening, can I thank you for once again giving us a very entertaining and informative presentation this evening. And knowing the Brennan that we have got with us this evening, I'm sure you're going to have quite a few questions. Okay. So I'm just going to try and scroll down and see if there's any. There is a very nice comment, Bob, here that I'll read out first of all. Hashtag, this is one of the best presentations I have ever listened to since I joined Freemasonry. I've looked at this very painting many, many times, but never knew of these people or these stories. Thank you, Bob.
Good, my pleasure.
So, from Ken Wallace, Bob, the brother in the southeast wearing the green-grey jacket appears to be holding something resembling a camera in his outstretched right arm. Any thoughts on this?
Right, let me just call up the picture. Of course, I did close it down. Is that in the kind of organ loft area? I'm just trying to, let me just.
In the southeast, he's saying.
So that's what, left-hand side.
Bottom
Sorry,
left.
I'm bottom left. He's holding a camera.
No, it'll be well. It'll be about the middle on the left, I would think, Bob, just in front of the dais.
So he's
behind. If you look at the top left-hand corner, you'd see it.
Oh, Ken's there, so.
Top left.
Top left-hand corner.
Oh, is this the figure? You can just see his head, shoulders, and arm.
Yeah, and his arms outstretched. And
yeah.
It looks like
yeah. Yeah. What I mean, this is what we used to do at school. They're passing notes to each other. Because they don't want to interrupt the ceremony, unlike today when some people are happy to talk. No, they're notes. In the original, you can see it's a little piece of paper with some scribbling on it. So that's what they're doing. They're passing notes together. Because he's passing it to someone in the organ loft, I suspect it's some kind of request for music once the wee ceremony is over.
We've got.
Sure it's not Sweetie.
Well, it might be. It might say Tunnocks on the wrapper. That could be what the writing is.
Well, Sir Boyd is a good Freemason as well, as we know, Brother Bob. Ian Kennedy makes a comment. His good lady researched Peter Williamson doing a family history, and it is believed that he was the inspiration for a man called Horse.
It's not impossible, actually. It's not impossible because when the Peter's book, French and Indian Cruelty in the Colonies, I can't remember the full title. I mean, I have had thoughts about reprinting it, but it's actually very gruesome. He describes in enormous detail exactly what happened to certain individuals, men, women, and children. And I think probably it would not be appropriate in this day and age, because the people who were committing the torture were Indians, so probably not politically acceptable anymore. But remembering what Richard Harris goes through in terms of his initiation into the Indian tribe would not surprise me at all that that's where that inspiration came from. I would need to reread the book, to be honest, in order to be able to sort of say more firmly than that.
Ian Glennie, you've got a question. If you'd like to unmute yourself, please.
Bob, thank you for the presentation. A couple of observations. First of all, it was St Michael's Kirkyard and no St Cuthbert's.
All right, okay.
And in terms of the Masonic connection, 200 years after the mausoleum was commissioned, the Brethren of Dumfries held a rededication ceremony for the mausoleum, and they actually checked that the mausoleum was both level, plumb and square, using the tools from the Operative Lodge of Dumfries 140, and these were indeed the very tools that were used at the original commissioning of that mausoleum. And as a result, the Masonic connection of Burns could never have been more public at that time. It was sad that no more Freemasons were there. There were less than 150 of us there. My question is this: in terms of Captain Francis Gross, as many people in their immortal memory say, gross by name and gross by nature, because of his corpulent frame, he did 2 drawings of the old kirk at Alloway, one of which appeared in the Antiquities of Scotland. But there was another one that was given to Burns himself, and it was chosen because it was taken from a view that showed Burns's mother and father's grave. And no one can find that picture these days. Any views on that, Bob? Do you know if it still exists within the museum in Edinburgh? Not the Masonic one, but the National Museum, or is it lost forever?
Yeah, I don't know where it is. Unfortunately, on Burns' death, lots of things that he owned seem to have been cast to the 4 winds. I know that he did have that Francis's picture on the wall, his wall. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, he had it transferred to his bedroom, and it was in his bedroom when he died. And so, who knows, souvenir hunters and all the rest of it, you know. But I don't know of its whereabouts now, sadly.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Ian. Bob, a question from Bob Potter. How many brethren in the painting have you identified? Secondly, they seem to be wearing English-style aprons. Is that correct?
Yes. In fact, you know, in the painting, there's only one individual that we haven't identified, and that's the guy who's seated on the right-hand side, just inside the entryway, where you can see two characters coming through. The guy to their left, we don't know who he is, but everyone else is named. The artist, William Stuart Watson, I'm sure it is, he named everyone who was in the painting, so we know who they all are. Some of them we know a lot about because we've got their name, and some of them are simply not important enough. That's the right word? Not prominent enough to be able to go into great detail as to their lives. But yeah, we know them all except that one individual. He's labelled as a visitor. As to the aprons, this goes back to the formation of the Grand Lodge of Scotland. And what happened was, because the Grand Lodge of England had been founded some years earlier, the people in Edinburgh who were responsible for sort of trying to organise a new body called a Grand Lodge, they went to, or they modelled everything on what had happened in London, right down to the necessity of having 4 lodges as founding lodges of the Grand Lodge of Scotland. Of course, a lot more eventually were involved, but the 4 lodges that I mentioned earlier were identical to the 4 lodges that founded the Grand Lodge of England. Now, we happen to know quite a lot about the formation of the Grand Lodge of Scotland and the people involved. And we know that there was one member of Canongate Kilwinning, in particular, a namesake, Richard Cooper, from London, who had come to Edinburgh to set up an engraving business here, which he ended up being extremely successful in. But he had strong ties with the new Grand Lodge in London. And it seems very clear that the exact details of how to form this newfangled body called the Grand Lodge, the instructions came, or information came from London to the members of Canongate Kilwinning via Richard Cooper, who also had a house in St. John Street, where the lodge building was and is. And so they decided to, you know, they didn't need to reinvent the wheel. They simply copied what they were doing in London right down to the shape of the aprons that they were using in England. And that's how they end up in the painting. Having said that, there's one small caveat to all that, that although the Grand Lodge was founded in 1736, this painting was not painted until 100 or so years after the founding of Grand Lodge. So we can't be sure that the aprons in the painting were identical to what they were using in 1736. But it seems clear that they retained the English influence. And today their aprons are very similar to that in the painting. And indeed, unlike most of Scottish lodges, they also celebrate St. John the Baptist's Day, which is very uncommon in Scotland and never featured in Scottish Freemasonry. And if it does, it's probably more by accident than design. So yes, sorry for the kind of long-winded answer, but that's what we are pretty sure happened.
Thank you, Bob. Hopefully that answers your question, Bob Potter. There's a comment from Dr. Douglas Nichol, asking me to tell the Bren here this evening about the connections of the Burns family with the Lodge Hope of Kurrachee. But for the sake of time, Bren, I will put information up on the Facebook pages afterwards. And I think as a lodge, we are very proud to have that connection as well. There is also another lodge in Fife that has got a connection to Burns family, and that's Lodge St Cerf. Some would argue that's the jewel in the province. Some would say that it's not, but that's a debate locally. But I think what that comes back to, Brother Bob Cooper, is that, again, the Provincial Grand Lodge of Fife and Kinross in our province here can claim great antiquity to all these famous Freemasons, and I will keep on fighting that good fight. Finlay Ross has a comment. First time I've noticed the organ in the photo. That is, I believe, the original organ. And I was surprised to see when I visited that it's still being a hand bellow style. Can Bob confirm if it is in fact the case? Well, Finlay, I can confirm it's still a hand bellow because 6 months ago I had to sit next to the organist and I had to pump that organ up and down. And it does take a little bit of complexity. Bob, any further comment on the history of the organ?
Yes, the organ is quite famous. It was made by John Schnetzler, a German organ maker who had an organ making factory in London, and so it's a very famous organ because not many of them made it this far north. The story goes, I don't think this is any way recent, but certainly maybe 50 more years ago, the lodge decided that, as a lodge rule, that anyone who was last in the lodge before the tile, that last person was the official organ bellows pumper. And what happened was, of course, nobody wanted to be the organ bellows pumper. And so people started arriving earlier and earlier for the lodge meeting. And typically the meeting was fully packed by an hour before. And they were all waiting, praying that somebody would be the last guy in, so that the last one of them didn't have to actually pump the organ. Needless to say, that rule didn't last terribly long because it threw the timetable completely out of the window. So, but that was one of the stories that an old past master told me some years ago. So I don't know if it's true, but it's a wonderful story nonetheless.
Okay. Thank you, Bob. Callum says he's away to get his copy of Tam O'Shanter out and reread it to find out, see if he can spot the Masonic clues, and I'm sure there'll be other Bren doing that this evening. Craig Allison's got a question for you. Do you think it bothered Burns that he didn't become master of the lodge?
Well, a little bit of confusion here. In those days, the master of the lodge was essentially usually, certainly in the rural areas where Burns lived, for example, was a locally prominent individual. And another good example, just to make that point, the lodge of Kirkintilloch, I'm sure it's Kirkintilloch, the local laird was the Earl of Kilmarnock, and they wanted him as the master of their lodge, regardless of the fact that he wasn't even a Freemason. So they kept writing to him to become a master of the lodge, and this was very important in those days, to have a locally powerful person who was going to sort of protect you, if you like, from ne'er-do-wells. And so Kilmarnock actually became master of the lodge before he was initiated. Now, same thing happened in rural Ayrshire, where the local laird became the master of the lodge, and he was typically asked to make some kind of financial contribution for the honour, but they very, very rarely attended the lodge. So what actually happened was, although the local laird would be the master, the depute master, in Burns's case, the depute master performed all the functions of the master of the lodge because the master never turned up. So when Burns was the depute master of his lodge, he performed all the functions that we would perform today as a master. and he did so for quite a long time, for a period of 2 or 3 years, and he was in fact deputy master, or in effect master, of the lodge when his brother Gilbert was initiated, for example. So no, I don't think he had any regrets, because he was doing exactly what the master would do anyway.
Yeah. We've got lots of other comments in the chat. Congratulations to you, Bob. There's a couple of references to where you can pick up a book, a Grand Lodge of Scotland book, that talks more about the painting as well. There's a comment, and I'm sure this is rather tongue-in-cheek, from one of the Bren from Lodge number 2, saying that he's never heard about that organ in 40 years. But I'm sure that's just Charles and his little joke. So as far as I can see, Bren, I think we've covered out all the questions that are in the chat. Let me just have a quick double check. There is one question, Bob, and I don't think it's one that you're able to answer currently in the current situation, so I'll probably help you out on this one. And the question is, would you be prepared to do this as an open presentation within Freemasons Hall and Grand Lodge to the public? But I think that's something that would need to be talked about in the future. Yeah,
well, when we know, we can say, Gordon, that when we know members of the public are there and we're talking about the painting, and we do get lots of members of the public, we get lots of non-Masons. Typically, a Mason from America will turn up with his wife. They will turn up as a group. And so we give a lecture on the painting, but of course, we don't go in depth into the Masonic side of things. So the story about Peter Williamson and his connection with North America goes down very well. So we just simply modify the lecture a bit to suit the audience, basically. We have another question for you, Bob, and I'm not surprised that this comes from a provincial Grand Master, as one of his duties is to check annually on lodges and how good the ritual work is. So Dougie Filan's question to you, is there any report on how good Burns was as a master and at his ritual? No, as simple as that, there isn't. But lots of reports of his eloquence when meeting other people is on record. That's why he was in many ways so successful in Edinburgh. If he was a real ruffian or a roughneck, redneck, call him what you will, he simply wouldn't have been invited to polite society for conversations over a cup of tea. And of course, you may know of the famous painting, the one and only time that he met Sir Walter Scott, when Sir Walter Scott was a young, I think he was a teenager. And Scott, I think, remarks on the fact that this man was extremely well spoken and obviously very intelligent. So there's many accounts as to his ability. As well as that, apparently, and I can't remember where the source of this is, but apparently he was a very good singer as well. So all that sort of suggests to me that he would be very good at his ritual, because he was able to obviously to recite his own poetry, and he even sing and hold conversations with the intelligentsia of Edinburgh. So I've got no doubt that he was exceptionally good at his ritual.
Bob, on behalf of the members of Lodge Hope of Kurrachee and all our visitors, can I once again thank you so much for coming along this evening and giving us the benefits of your knowledge. Bren, next week I will be looking forward to introducing to you Brother Mike Hearn, who is a past master of Lodge Felix, one of our sister research and lecture lodges up in Aberdeenshire. And he's going to talk to us about Freemasonry in the Middle East. Those of you who may be up on things about the Middle East will appreciate that Lodge Felix was originally one of the Scottish lodges over there, and I think that's what has inspired Mike to research lodges in the Middle East. This coming Thursday, Brian, it's a very special day for my dad. He's had me for 50 years, and I look forward to him bestowing me with presents. And I'm only saying that to you, Brian, because he's on the meeting this evening. But it's also the Grand Lodge of Scotland have decided to give me a very special birthday present. And the Heritage and History Group will be launching their first lecture. It will be at 7 o'clock. It's been advertised on Scottish Craft Freemasonry pages, and it will be a presentation by the Provincial Grand Master of Kilwinning, Brother Tom Wood, and he will be talking and discussing the Mother Lodge, Mother Kilwinning number nothing. As I intimated at the beginning, Brian, for those of you who want to join that, you need to change your name to Gordon Mickey and your lodge number. That is one of the small rules that the chaps from the History and Heritage Group have implemented. So I look forward to seeing many of you at that on Thursday evening. Brian, as usual, I'm going to try and unmute you all. If I use the mouse for the right computer, the challenges of having two computers next to you, Brian, and allow you to say your own thank yous and good evenings to Brother Bob Cooper. Bob, once again, thank you, sir. You're unmuted.
Thank you, brother.
Much.
Bob.
Thank you, Bob, very much.
Cheers, Bob.
Thank you very much, Bob.
Cheers, Bob.
Splendid.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob, very much.
Okie dokie.
Thanks, Bob. That was excellent.
Excellent. Oh, thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Well done, Bob. Take care. See you soon. Thanks, Bob.
Thanks,
Bye,
Bob, for entertaining us again. Take care.
Bye.
Bob, that
Thanks,
was
Kim.
absolutely brilliant.
Well
Cheers,
done,
thanks.
Bob. I like the presentation for the new beard.
Ellis, he'll get you every place, Ronnie.
Fools and horses, come to mind. Fools and horses.
There's no barbers open in Edinburgh.
Well, in the war.
Thank you, Bob. Excellent lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bob, thank you very much indeed for an excellent presentation. That was lovely. And also, thank you to Nobby and Gordon for inviting me. Thank you.
Okay, good stuff.
Brother
Thank
Bob, Brother Bob, thanks very much. Great lecture, one of your better ones. When are we going to hear about the other characters in the painting?
Well, yeah, I mean, we could easily do that again. There's a lot of them there. I think there's over 80. Although some, as I say, some of them aren't terribly well known. But yeah, they were just my personal favourites. But there's lots of others worth talking about.
I look forward to that one, Bob.
Thank you, Bob, very much for your very informative, excellent lecture as usual.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Excellent presentation. Really enjoyed it.
Good. Thanks very much, Tony.
Thank you, Bob.
All right. John, yeah, nice to see you.
Right, Brian, I'm going to give us our normal final countdown, but I just did see one brother there that I would just like to give a little mention to, Brother Alistair Slider Marshall. This is your penultimate day as the Provincial Grand Master of Stirlingshire, and I would just like to thank you, sir, for the support that you've given to Lodge Hope of Kurrachee during your term as Provincial Grand Master. And sir, I hope you enjoy your retirement and that you keep on coming around the lodge. Brian, I'm going to give you 5, 4.
Thank you, Bob.
3.
Thanks very much, Bob.
2.
Thank you, Bob. Thank
1.
you. Stay safe.
Thank you, Bob.
Good evening, Brian. Thank you.
Bye all.
Good night.